Good afternoon. Okay. It's not lunch with books until we say that 3 times. Just a general announcement that you hear every week. Please silence your cell phones now. Out of respect for our speakers, so we don't have those going off in the middle of the program. There is a mailing box in the back there. If you want to be added to our email list, you can just drop your email in there, or if you want to, the other side of the mailing form has suggestions, so if you have any suggestions or comments, you can put that in the box as well. In addition, you'll see there are evaluation forms on your table. These are for the West Virginia Humanities. This program is being sponsored by the West Virginia Humanities program, so your feedback is incredibly, it's very valuable. So if you could fill those out, please, it'll help us get grants like these in the future to bring more speakers like Silas to the library. So following the program, if you could just take a few minutes to fill those out, we'd really appreciate it. So happy early Thanksgiving. Today we're very thankful to have Silas House with us. We do have his books for sale here at this table. They're $10 a piece. If you want to have them signed, we do request that you put a mask on before you approach the table for Silas to sign them. And there are Post-it notes here. If you could print your name out so that he knows exactly how to spell it in the book. There are Post-it notes and pens on this table. So if you, following the program, you can purchase a book and then take it over for Silas to sign. And we have the masks on that table as well if you didn't bring your own. If you have questions for Silas, just at the end of the program, just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you so that you can we can hear you clearly. And that's all the announcements I have for today's program. Next week at Lunch with Books, Tuesday, November 3rd at noon, we have Michael Harvia with us. He was a photographer with the Intelligence newspaper, and he took some amazing black and white photos of wheeling in the 1970s and 80s. He's posted a lot of them on the Facebook group Memories of Wheeling, so if you've seen them, you know how amazing these photos are. He'll be here next week to share a selection of his personal favorites, and he'll give us some background and context for the photos as well. Then in 2 weeks, it's December 7th, Tuesday, December 7th, it's Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day. We'll have West Virginia University history professor James Seichmeyer with us. He'll talk about the history of the United States-Japan relations prior to the attack, the reasons for the attack, and the long-term significance of it. That's December 7th at noon. And then just jumping a little ahead here, I'm going to tell you about our holiday program, which will be December 21st. Don Feenerty will be doing a Simple Life Christmas special. This is based on the Foxfire books. He did one for us online last year, but he's very excited to do one in the library this year. And we'll have musical guest Fair May with us for that. And then just a reminder that next Thursday, December 2nd at 7 p.m., we'll be starting our People's University series. It's an 8-week series on the Cold War. Everybody should have brochures on their table that has the schedule of the classes. The first class is the Iron Curtain Rising, What Was the Cold War? It's with instructor Gary Capel. If you've ever heard Gary speak, he's an excellent lecturer. So today, to present our guests, I'm going to introduce our good friend, who's also an accomplished author of numerous children's books and poetry. Please welcome the Poet Laureate of West Virginia, Mark Harshman.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks so much. And thank you to you and Sean together for all you've done to continue to build this Lunch with Books series, which is unlike anything I know in the whole state. We really are privileged to have this series going on. So, my friends, this is a very special day, for we have with us not only one of the finest writers that we can claim from Appalachia, but surely one of the most distinctive voices in contemporary American fiction. Silas has become for me, Silas House has become for me, and I suspect for many others, the one individual who speaks best for our region. He is the nationally best-selling author of 6 novels, Clay's Quilt, I'm not going to give their dates, A Parchment of Leaves, The Coal Tattoo, Eli the Good, Same Sun Here, co-authored with Neela Vaswani, and his most recent Southernmost, about which you'll hear soon. There's also a book of creative nonfiction, Something's Rising, that he co-authored with Jason Howard in 2009, and 3 plays. I'd love to hear more about them. Silas is also a former correspondent for NPR's All Things Considered. His writing has appeared in Time, The Atlantic, Ecotone, Oxford America, and many others. And thinking of nonfiction, thanks to my wife Cheryl, I almost missed this. I mean, not thanks to her, thanks to her, I did find it. His recent article in The Atlantic, Some Americans No Longer Believe in the Common Good. I can't recommend this enough. Of everything you may have read about the vaccine, the pandemic, the state of America, it's a must read, I would say, for all of us. Okay, going on, Silas serves on the fiction faculty of the Spalding School of Creative Writing and as the NEH Chair at Berea College. He is as well the recipient of honorary doctorates, winner of the Nautilus Award, E.B. White Award, the Appalachian Book of the Year, the Storylines Prize from the New York Public Library NAV Foundation, the Lee Smith Award, and many other honors, including an invitation to read at the Library of Congress. Southernmost was a long list finalist for the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction and appeared on all kinds of best books to read lists. He's also been awarded the Weatherford Award and the Judy Gaines Young Award. As a music journalist, Silas has worked with artists such as Casey Musgraves, Chris Christopherson, Lucinda Williams, Jason Isbell, Leanne Womack, Tyler Childers, and many others. He's the host of the popular podcast On the Porch, and in 2021 he was the recipient of the Governor's Award from the Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear for his service to the arts in his home state, and that's a big deal, by the way. Personally, I've always found in the novels that Silas has written not only plots that simply won't let me go, but the most intriguing and satisfying of characters, people I either want to know better or people I feel as if I've known all my life. About his newest novel, Southernmost, heavens, as a poet, I was in love with it from the very first page. The day dawned without any sign of sun. A sky had grown open from a black night to a dull, purpling gray of the morning. And not only here, but throughout, his imagery is accurate, telling, and moving. And all kinds of other quotes I wanted to share, but this is going on. But I love the one about chickens having been sent to the hen house by my mother because she was terrified of them. Anyway, in the end, I can only say that Southernmost is an incredibly needed book right now, calling out a kind of homegrown hypocrisy that is festering throughout our land that must be faced if the great American experiment in democracy is to move forward. And it's a gift to us all that Silas has written a book that might point the way for us. Please, please give a warm welcome to Silas House.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's wonderful to have such a gracious introduction from one of my favorite poets. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate Aaron and everybody here at the library. I'm amazed that you all do this every week. It's a lot of work. So thanks to all the library staff for doing that. Well, I am going to talk to you for a little bit about Southernmost, my most recent book. I'll tell you a little bit about why and how I wrote it. I'll read a little bit from it. And then the main reason that I drove almost 5 hours up here is so we have a conversation about it. So I hope that you all will want to talk some about writing or the book or Appalachia or whatever you want to talk about. I just really appreciate people who care enough about the written word to come out for lunch and spend some time with writers. So first, Southernmost came out in 2018. It's my most recent book. I have another one coming out in September. And it's about a 35-year-old pastor. His name is Asher Sharp. He's an evangelical preacher living in the small community of Cumberland Valley, Tennessee. The novel begins in June 2015, excuse me, on the day marriage equality has been passed by the Supreme Court. So on this same day, a devastating flood hits the community and sets the novel into motion. For the past 10 years, Asher has been quietly evolving in his values, especially on this issue after his brother came out to him. He initially rejected his brother Luke in the worst way possible, and Luke disappeared. So over that 10-year period, Asher has been quietly seeking out literature and music and theological teachings that have expanded his notions of God and belief. When the flood hits, two things in particular happen that cause him to have to make a really big decision. One is that a gay couple who has recently moved to the community had lost their home in the flood, and when they come to his house seeking shelter, his wife turns them away. Secondly, people within his congregation begin to blame the flood on the Supreme Court decision, saying that it's God's judgment. These two things are too much for Asher to deal with, and he decides he must make a stand against this kind of thinking. So he makes a call for equality within the congregation. He wants the couple to be welcomed. He's promptly fired, and excuse me, his marriage falls apart, and eventually he loses, for complicated reasons, he loses custody of his little boy, who is 9 years old, and he makes the rash decision to kidnap him and run off to Key West, Florida, where he thinks his brother may be. But before I knew any of that, here's some of the covers of the book. I forgot to show you. But before I knew anything that I just told you, all I really had in mind was this riverbank. This body of water straddles the Kentucky-Tennessee border near where I grew up. It's my favorite place in the world. And I just knew that I had a story to tell that revolved around this scene. But if you've read the novel, you know that this scene really doesn't show up until the last 3 pages of the book. So the whole book is aiming towards this. But I want to show it to you because books do often begin, for me at least, and for a lot of writers I know, as an image that you just can't get out of your mind. And water informs the entire book. It's there all the way through. And I'll read you a couple of excerpts that illustrate that. So I also had to figure out what my trouble was. When you're writing a novel, the most important thing for a novelist is the trouble. So I'm always looking to the world to give me, ideas and premises and things of that nature. To get a really good book, you have to have really good characters who are in a lot of trouble. And so I happened upon this little headline in the newspaper. An Amber Alert has been issued for 9-year-old Jessica Hooper. She was last seen with 30-year-old Eliza Hooper on June 1st. And so I thought that would be that would be an interesting thing to explore, a kidnapping. There's so many layers of trouble there. There's so many complexities. And just reading the last names and the ages, I thought this is probably a custody battle, and probably the woman is running off with the child to gain custody. When we see that a woman has taken a child, our minds immediately go to that the woman is protecting the child. When we see that a father has kidnapped a child, our immediate assumption is that the father is doing it for spite, or he's going to harm the child or something like that. We base these assumptions on a history of things like that happening. But I wanted to flip the script on that in this book and have a really good man, a really good father who is at his wit's end, and he makes this rash decision and he kidnaps his child. And to play with some of those assumptions that we have. So I got my trouble. And about the time I knew that this father was going to kidnap, that's all I knew so far. that I'm aiming towards this riverbank. I have a father who's kidnapping a child. That's all I know. And then I'm invited to go to Key West, Florida for 2 weeks. I was there for the Key West Literary Seminar. Tiari Jones, some of you may have read her book, An American Marriage, which was a big hit recently. She and I were the emerging voices, the new voices that year in 2008. And so we were able to spend 2 weeks there. And as soon as I arrived in Key West, I knew that this was where I wanted the father to run off to when he kidnapped Justin. For one thing, I wanted to spend more time in Key West, and I wanted a good excuse to go there. But more than that, Key West was the opposite in so many ways of where I knew my character was from, this little mountain town in Tennessee. It's the opposite in climate and culture, in the quality of light, in matters of acceptance, progressive thought, in flora and fauna, and music, food, everything. It's a place of the ocean versus Asher's home, which is a place of the river. And there was just such a richness there for a writer to explore. I just had to use it. The sense of place was so thick, I knew it would just be a treasure trove for me to write about. And so I did get to spend about 3 months total in Key West, but that's over a period of about 7 years that I would go there, you know, for 3 or 4 days at a time and just totally immerse myself in the place. One way I did this was to look at other writers who had written about Key West, and there are a lot of them. Probably the most famous is Ernest Hemingway. He was the one I was least interested in, though. Tennessee Williams is also known for living in Key West. He wrote about Key West. But what informed me the most about Key West was the poetry about it. And the two main poets of Key West are Wallace Stevens and Elizabeth Bishop. And I did really zoom in on Elizabeth Bishop's poetry. And this poem in particular, Sandpiper. And basically, I won't read the whole thing to you just for the sake of time, but it's about a bird, a sandpiper, who, and sandpipers are sort of like, in Appalachia, we have the cardinal. It's sort of our tough bird, you know, that we really, a lot of us identify with. We think of it as a real survivor and a thing of real beauty. I always think of the cardinal. Where I'm from, we call it redbird. It's sort of a symbol of Appalachia for me. And the sandpiper is sort of that way in a subtropics climate. It's just a really tough survivor. And in the poem, it says he runs to the south. It says he's a student of Blake. And then later, watching rather the spaces of sand between them where no detail too small the Atlantic drains. And so I was really seeing my two main characters in this poem. First of all, Asher runs as far to the south as he can to go to Key West. And he is a student of Blake, which I'll explain here in a minute. And then the other part is watching. This bird is always watching and observing, and that's Justin, the 9-year-old. He has a deep empathy, and he observes everything. He's incredibly empathetic to the point of suffering for it. And so every time I would sit down to write, I would read this poem out loud, and that would ease me into that space that I needed to be. So I'm just trying to give you some insights into the process of the novel. When you're working on something for 8 years, you have to do whatever it takes to sustain yourself, you know? And so that's one of the things I do is I find something like this to put me in that world. And so I must have read this poem hundreds of times out loud to put me there. But when I say that he's a student of Blake, William Blake was a poet and an artist who operated around this concept of for everything that lives is holy. And this would be my main thesis for the novel. When I'm working on a novel, I really want a thesis to go back to time and time again, something that I can make sure that I'm building my structure properly if I have that foundation of that thesis. Once you start thinking this way, that everything is holy, it changes the way you see everything, the way you walk through the world. In many ways, it must become a sort of monastic existence, and you have to really separate yourself from the real world to get into this headspace. And one person that really popularized this notion is Thomas Merton, who I'm sure some of you know. In the 1960s and 70s, he was one of the major religious figures in the world, and certainly in America. And I grew up not too far from where Merton lived for most of his life in Kentucky. He changed the phrase to everything that is holy, and really popularized that. And he was really popular because he sort of merged, he was very ecumenical. So he merged old school Catholic ways of thinking with sort of Buddhist ways of thinking. And so older people in the 60s and 70s related to him, but hippies also related to him. And so he merged those worlds. And at a time when there was real generation gap, Merton managed to bring people together in a way that few other people did. And he largely went by this notion: everything that is holy. And so my 9-year-old character, he operates by this notion. He's so empathetic. He cares deeply about everybody. And so more and more the book presented itself as a very religious book to me, a very theological book where I'm thinking a lot about notions of belief and doubt and things of that nature. So of course I was attracted to the writings of Thomas Merton. When I was in graduate school in Louisville, I happened upon a state historical marker. I don't know about West Virginia, but in Kentucky, we love state historical markers. And anywhere, a governor was born or whatever a cabin was, 200 years ago, we have a historical marker for that. And they're mostly really, really good. And so here in the middle of downtown Louisville is a historical marker. And it recounted that Thomas Merton had a sort of out-of-body experience. So it must be the only state historical marker that is about somebody having sort of a vision from God. And so here's the way Merton wrote about it. In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. There's no way of telling people that they're walking around shining like the sun. And so I thought, if we could all think like this and walk through the world, what a better place it would be, And so I was working with characters who felt this way. They're really hard to pull off if you put them down in the real world, and they're not like monks like Thomas Merton. They're just normal, everyday people. But that's what I was trying to do. And so I looked at a lot of art that dealt with this sort of thing. This is my favorite Ingmar Bergman movie. It's called Winter Light, and it's about a priest who has lost his belief in God. So you can't get in much worse shape as a priest than that, And so I thought, I'll give that to my preacher. He hasn't lost his belief, but he's lost his ability to pray. He's lost his deep faith, and he doesn't really believe what he's preaching anymore. So you can't get in much more trouble than that to be a person of faith, and especially a person of faith who's leading other people of faith, and you're not sure what you believe anymore. So sometimes people read the book and they'll get about, 20 pages into it, and they'll write a review on Amazon and say, and I threw this book down because it's about somebody that doesn't believe in God anymore. Well, that's not what it's about at all. It's about somebody who's rekindling and reshaping the way they believe, and their belief is solidified and made stronger by this self-examination. I looked at books like The Color Purple, Abide With Me by Elizabeth Strout, Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, Zora Neale Hurston's Jonas Gordvine, Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory, Willa Cather's Death Comes for the Archbishop. Because these were books that were exploring some of the same things I was thinking about, and I was figuring out how to write about them in a really different way. And so one way I did that was I have my 9-year-old character sort of create his own theology. He's seen a lot of upset in the church he grew up in, and a lot of people at odds with each other. And so he just wants to sort of think about God existing in everything that there is. And so that's the way he thinks about it. So here's a little scene with him. Justin used to think the trees were God, but today, right here, he thinks the ocean might be God. all that power and weakness spread out for us to see. The ocean can do so much when it wants to, and sometimes it can do nothing but go in and out, waves and smoothness. The ocean is a mystery, and so is God. They're both so big we cannot see them, all of them at the same time, but we can see pieces of them here and there, in everything and everybody. Justin believes God is big like the ocean, even bigger. Lots of people don't. They think he's small enough to fit only in a church or only in a book or only in an offering plate. He's not, and his mind is even bigger. People look at the ocean and they usually only see blueness, but there's so many other colors. Right now, Justin can see 10 different shades of blue, lots of greens. There are lines of brown and the white lips of the waves. When the light hits the water in a certain way, there will be even more colors: red, orange, peach, purple. At night, there will be gray and eventually black. Justin thinks God's eyes are that color, every color. He thinks God is not only in the ocean, but also in his dog and in the sand and the trees and every person on this beach, every person in the world. Today, right this minute, Justin can see nothing but ocean, and that is the everything. And Justin can feel the everything beneath his hand where he's resting his palm on the dog's chest, and the dog's heart thrums in a steady rhythm like the waves on the beach. He can feel the everything under himself in the gritty sand. He can smell it in the seaweed. He can hear it in the laughter of the people down the beach and in the metal sound of the airplane sliding over them. The ocean is God, but so are we all. And so another thing I did was to look to music to really inform me about my characters. And so I had an artist that went with each character in my book. So I have a character named Belle who's obsessed with Joni Mitchell. And so every time that I was writing Belle, I was listening to Joni Mitchell. And that helped me to understand Belle. And there are scenes where she's singing Joni Mitchell or playing Joni Mitchell on the piano. Or I have my character Asher, who looks to a lot of music to go deeper into his melancholy and things of that nature. And so over the course of the book, like I said, I started in 2008, and by 2010, I'm moving along. I'm still trying to create my character, but I don't quite know the place yet. And at the time, I'm working a lot. I work a lot in Nashville. As Mark said, I work a lot in the music industry. I write mostly anonymous things like liner notes or things that go out to journalists with musicians in Nashville. And so I was spending a lot of time there. And in 2010, the most devastating flood in about 50 years hit the area. And 40 people died. Thousands of homes were destroyed. And I also had personal experience of a flood. As a child, my family escaped our trailer at the last minute in a rowboat. As a big, huge flash flood came through, my mother and I were home alone, and so some people came and got us out in a rowboat. And I thought that would be a good device to I thought about how during natural disasters, it brings out the best in people and the worst in people. And so I thought I might try to use the flood and just see what happened. I knew that it would allow me to have a lot of emotion and action and suspense. And so I thought I would try to use it as the opening action piece of the novel. So I had this natural disaster that could set everything into motion. So I'm going to read just a little bit from the opening. Yeah, these are all scenes from that flood. I'm going to read just a little bit from that opening. What's my time? The rain had been falling with a pounding meanness without ceasing for 2 days, and then the water rose all at once in the middle of the night, a brutal rush, so fast Asher thought at first a dam might have broken somewhere upstream. The ground had simply become so saturated it could not hold any more water. All the creeks were conspiring down the ridges until they washed out into the Cumberland. There was no use in anyone going to bed because they all knew what was going to happen. They only had to wait. The day dawned without any sign of sun, a sky that groaned open from a black night to a dull purpling gray of morning, and Asher went out to walk the ridge and get a full eye on the situation. The news wasn't telling them anything worthwhile. He could hear the flood before he reached the top of the ridge. There he saw the massively swollen river supping at the edges of the lower fields, 10 feet above its own banks, a foamy broth climbing so steadily he could actually see its ascent. His son, Justin, would not leave his side. "Are we going to be okay?" Justin asked. His green eyes latched onto Asher's green eyes. "Yes, buddy," Asher said, his hand capped over his son's head. "Don't you worry now." But Asher was worried. Even worse than the rising water, even worse than the fact that he had not heard one siren or seen one helicopter or any sign of help. Even worse than when the electricity blinked out of being was that they couldn't find their little dog, Roscoe, anywhere. And so Asher has to go into action trying to find the dog. He has to go get his mother-in-law, and he has to take care of his congregation. And all the while, he's in real torment. He doesn't, his marriage is falling apart, et cetera, et cetera. So I have all my trouble that I need to get going. And once I have the trouble, then hopefully that keeps you as the reader invested, and you want to keep reading and find out more. And so I had known all this time that the kidnapping was going to happen in some way, and it would be related to faith. But for the first time, I realized that my lead character was this pastor who was going to have to stand up for what he believed in. And I really realized that in 2013, because something in the news happened that really transformed the novel. That year, the Reverend Frank Schaefer, a Methodist pastor in rural Pennsylvania, was asked by his gay son if he would perform his wedding ceremony. He knew that this was in direct opposition to the Methodist Church, but he chose his son over the church. As soon as it was revealed, he was defrocked and told that he would only be reinstated if he publicly apologized. He refused, taking a principled stand for his son. And he became a folk hero to a lot of people, especially rural LGBT folks. So he was the perfect inspiration for this preacher I've been writing about all this time. I knew that he had to stand up against his own community and make a principled stand. As you can see, it was a huge news story. And it just got me thinking more and more about that thesis and how that's connected to empathy, and how I have to, when I don't understand something, how I believe it's really my job to try to understand it better, or to try to walk in somebody else's shoes instead of to negate them or to condemn them. And I continued to write. And then in June of 2015, marriage equality did happen. And so it sort of negated my whole novel, because, you know, I couldn't publish a novel the year after marriage equality came out that was all about this lack of rights that the couple had and all that. So I had to re-examine it. And so what I did was I folded in the marriage equality decision, and I really focused on the way that there was such opposition to that change that happened. It's always, you know, progress is always 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and that always happens. And so that's what I began to examine. And then I realized that no, it wasn't necessarily negated. In a way, it was more relevant, because we were talking about these issues even more. We were in dialogue with each other even more about this. People who were in opposition to each other, who were in conflict. And what happened then was the whole nation's attention becomes focused on Appalachian Kentucky, where I'm from, around this issue. You all may remember Kim Davis. She was a county court clerk in Rowan County, Morehead, Kentucky, and she refused to issue marriage licenses to gay couples. Well, county court clerks were doing this all over the country. But she became the face of discrimination for months in our nation, and it was international news as well. She was sanctimonious, she was brazen, she was very defiant, and once again, Appalachians were being held up as symbols of backwardness. That bothered me because, like I said, this was happening all over the country, but suddenly we're the ones who are getting all the blame for it. It all becomes, the focus is all on us. She does show it very briefly in the novel. And as adamantly opposed as I was to what Kim Davis stood for, I wanted to write a novel in which nobody was a caricature. I thought it was my responsibility as a novelist to write a book in which everybody's beliefs were looked at closely and examined, and to really apply that notion of empathy to everyone. So that's one thing that I tried to do in the book. And all of this is really fueling the book, but at the same time, over and over again, I see Kim Davis, again, whom I adamantly disagree with, but I see her really negated based on the way she looks, and her accent, where she's from, things of that nature. So you see what I'm getting at? I wanted to explore those complexities, and I wanted to take a character like Kim Davis and put her in a novel and make her into a three-dimensional character, even though I, as the author, disagreed with her, and I knew a lot of my readers would disagree with her. But I really feel that that's the responsibility of the novelist, is to make every character as complex as possible. Now that gets hard to do when you're dealing with your antagonist, right? Because my problem is, and I've heard Lee Smith say this too, it's hard to have an antagonist because if you really get down into the humanity, if you really make a character three-dimensional, you've revealed the humanity, and you don't want your antagonist to be have too much humanity, or there won't be that conflict there. But I do think that I managed to do that in the book. I hope so. But like I said, my main goal was to not make anybody into a caricature. I wanted everybody to have complexity, and I wanted to look at the issue from all sides and really think about what empathy is. And sometimes the larger world doesn't want to think that way. I think that more and more we live in a world of absolutes, and it really troubles me. It's like, and I think a lot of this has to do with social media. As much as I think the internet is a great thing in many ways, I don't want to stand up here and be a Luddite, but I also think the internet's really awful in a lot of ways. And one thing it has done is allowed us to think about things in absolutes. They're really evil and they're really perfect. And that's the way we sort of separate out people now, like monsters and saints. And I think that can be really damaging to us as a country. And I think it's the role of the novel to explore the complexity, that gray, and not just the black and white that we so often talk in. So as I'm moving along, it's becoming the novel I want it to be. And all along the way, I have these writing assistants who are helping me. My dogs are always with me. And so one thing that happens in the book is that dogs become a real metaphor for the divine. I always say that if I consciously put in a motif or a symbol, it never works. But if it's organic, then it works. So when I finished the novel, I saw that dogs, in the beginning, a dog is missing. Asher's faith is struggling. Towards the end of the book, a dog is found. His belief becomes stronger. So the dog is sort of the presence of the divine. To me, that makes a lot of sense because I never feel more in the presence of goodness than when I'm with an animal. For me, it's a dog. For some people, it's a horse. Some people, it's a cat, whatever. For me, it's always been a dog ever since I've never in my life not had a dog. And so I'm going to close before I turn it over to y'all for some conversation. I'm going to read you this little scene where Asher finds a dog. And this is after the kidnapping. Asher sat by the window watching the trees. There were thirsty-looking pines and short little palm trees, and the parking lot blacktop was covered with a thin layer of sand. The trees were completely still in a way they never were back home in Tennessee. Maybe the birds were way back in the deepest parts of the woods where the pine shade was cool and fragrant, a better place for winged things than out by the treeless interstate where it was nothing but rotting motels and truck stops. They were in a motel near the Florida-Georgia border. Asher had driven more than 8 hours before he started falling asleep. He had coasted into the Shady Oaks Motel, gotten a room, and had dived into a hard sleep after making Justin swear to not leave. He had fallen asleep to the sound of his son watching TV, but now he was awake after only a couple of hours, and Justin's small snores were singing across the room to him. At least the room offered those 2 hours of sleep. There was a rust stain on the floor around the toilet. The bar of soap was thin as a Hershey bar and smelled like funeral flowers. The towels were like sandpaper. He was pretty sure there was dried vomit on the carpet in the corner, and Justin had said the remote felt sticky. It's perfect that the word shady is in this motel's name, Justin had said. This is the shadiest hellhole I've ever seen. Asher started to tell him to watch his mouth. Little boys shouldn't be handling language like that, but he didn't. Besides, Justin was right. Asher clicked off the TV, and now he sat on the air conditioner at the window. An old dog moseyed across the parking lot. If he were a dog, Asher thought, he'd be crawling up under a cool porch somewhere, getting off that hot blacktop. There was something pitiful about the dog. Asher reckoned he probably hadn't had a bath his entire life. He was black and white, but everything about him had been grayed by dust. The dog stopped and sniffed at the air. Maybe he was out hunting food, too hungry for lounging around under a porch. And then he turned and set his eyes right on Asher's. The dog's tongue lolled out, and it seemed to Asher that he had no idea what his next move might be, as if he had exhausted all of his options for survival. Asher padded into the bathroom and filled a thin plastic cup with water. He went outside, found the dog lying now, his back legs splayed out, his front paws tucked under his chest. Asher put his hand out so the old boy would draw in his scent. The dog sniffed his fingers, latched his eyes onto Asher's. "Hey there, buddy," Asher said. He set the cup on the sidewalk, and the dog glanced up at him to make sure it was a gift, and then his tongue lashed at the water as if his full thirst had only now overtaken him. Asher tipped the cup to the side so he could get more, and the dog looked up at him, and his eyes were saying, "Thank you so much. That's the best damn water I've ever had in my whole damn life." Then the dog was going crazy, licking Asher's hand, jumping up so he would squat down and give his full attention. He smelled like he'd rolled around in something dead and rotten. Asher petted him anyway. The dog looked like beagle, maybe some pit bull, maybe some mountain feist. He had a strong chest and a noble head, a slender but muscular body, despite his hunger. Asher patted down the dog's back, and he could feel pebbles under his skin that he knew was birdshot. Asher sat down on the grass and let the dog cover him up with loving. He didn't care how badly he stank. The dog climbed into his lap and licked at his face, perching one of his paws up on Asher's chest. And this was the first time Asher had felt truly happy in a long while. "Yes, sir, buddy, that's a good boy. Yes, him is," Asher sing-song to him. And the dog seemed to talk back by the way he wiggled and licked Asher's hands and face when he could sneak in a kiss. Here he was, Asher Sharp, on the run from the law. He had stolen his little boy, and he knew there was no way he was leaving this good old boy behind. So I have a quarter till. I think we have time for some questions. If anybody has any.
Yes, please. Raise your hand, as Warren said earlier. If you have any questions,
I just have a comment, and that is in your presentation also.
oh, okay. In your presentation, I love the way that you told us how you built this. And I don't get to hear that kind of thing very often. And so I thought that was fantastic. And then plus, tying in the imagery, the simple images that you had but weren't overwhelming, just enough to kind of give us something to kind of glaze on as you were going over different aspects of how you built the book. But the presentation was great. Just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Thank you. I like to take slides with me so people will have something to look at besides me. I get tired of hearing myself talk, and it gives you something to look at. What else?
Other questions? Please.
I'd just like to add to that, that Sean sent a comment that he said that this was a master class in writing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I did have a question about your use of onomatopoeia in the book.
Mm.
Do you spend a lot of time in silence listening to noises?
Yes. I mean, often it's if something presents itself in the book, you know, then I might say it out loud, or I do little exercises to capture that sort of thing, you know. There's a lot of trinities in the book, so I'm often counting things. I'm saying things 3 times, and you know, so I'm always talking to myself when I'm writing in that way, especially to get those sounds correct. I was raised in a store, and I think that has a lot to do with the kind of writer I am. My aunt ran a little bitty community. You know, there used to be little community stores all over Appalachia. They're disappearing, but in each little community there'd be we call them jot 'em down stores. I don't know if you all use that phrase here, but what that means is you didn't need cash. There was a little notebook, and they would jot down what you owed them, and at the end of the month you come and pay your bill. So my aunt ran a jot 'em down store, and I just was always there in the store, and it was sort of a community center. You know, people would come there and talk and tell big stories. And I learned that if I just sort of disappeared, slunk back, I would hear more interesting stories, you know, if I was quiet and didn't remind them that I was there. So I heard a lot of juicy tales and gossip. And so I think that really attuned my ear to listen. I was also raised in the Holiness Church. It was very strict. Yeah, we did everything but handle snakes, basically. You know, the running the aisles, shouting, speaking in tongues, the sort of the way people think all Appalachians have that religion. That's sort of the religion I grew up in. And so as a child, we went to church 3 or 4 times a week. Church often lasted 3 or 4 hours, and I had to entertain myself any way I could. I wasn't allowed to take my Star Wars figures with me, you know, but I could take a little notebook and a pencil, and so I would write down what I heard, and I would do little character sketches of people. So I really owe the store and the church, I think, mostly to being a writer.
Community you described growing up in had a lot in common with the characteristics of the old coal camps. Was that a coal camp?
Where I grew up?
Yeah, where you grew up.
Well, it wasn't technically a coal camp, but it was a place of coal mines and coal miners. Just about all the men on my mother's side of the family were miners. My papa was a coal miner who lost his leg in the mines and then died of black lung. And so my first 3 books deal a lot with the coal industry, and are set. There is a coal camp that shows up in my first 3 books. It's a trilogy of they're connected books. So that is something that I grew up right across from a strip mine, and that had a big impact on my childhood. It was, you know, on one hand, it was such a beautiful place that I grew up, and we were always outside, but the strip mine really changed the community, and yet everybody in my family made their living from the coal mine, you know, so it was a real paradox in that way, that I think allowed me to think about things from a complex way from an early age, if that makes sense. But I definitely come from a coal mining family.
So you migrated then from the coal industry to the general community in terms of what you expected, like being able to go in and sign for your groceries and pay up at the end of the month.
Yes, right. Yeah, there wasn't a company store or anything like that in my town. That would have been maybe a generation or two before me. But by the time I was growing up, my county didn't have as much coal as the counties around it. It had sort of been mined out, because my county was the first county in Kentucky to be mined.
I have a quick question, and then hopefully it'll be okay to talk about a character that appears later
Sure.
in the novel. I was intrigued by Belle,
Mm-hmm.
and I was wondering, you talked a little bit about the inspirations for the other characters, so maybe a little bit more about her.
Yeah, when Asher gets to Key West, he sort of luckily falls in with this woman named Belle. She runs sort of an inn. It's like a complex of cottages. And she's the kind of person that just takes in strays, is the way I would say it. She takes in people who need help. And to me, she's like just the epitome of empathy and what I think of true Christianity being, somebody that helps others every way they can. And more and more, I think that a lot of mainstream Christianity that I see is getting away from that idea of service. That really troubles me. And so I wanted to look at different kinds of Christians in particular in the book, not just people of faith, but particularly Christians, and show how there's a wide array of that in our country and I guess in the world. For me, she sort of epitomized a lot of people I know who just very quietly do good work. She's not out there asking for any kind of recognition, or in fact, she likes to do that pretty secretly, and so I just loved her as a character. She's somebody that really lives with me, I think. One of the characters that I still think about, and she's the one that loves Joni Mitchell. That's sort of the soundtrack for her. Anything else?
There's another question from an online viewer, from Sean again. You mentioned your favorite authors. Who are your favorite songwriters?
I think the best living songwriter right now, well, I shouldn't say the best living songwriter, but my favorite living songwriter is Jason Isbell, I think. I just think for my generation, he's sort of the one that I think about a lot. In Kentucky, where I'm from, Tyler Childers, I think, is a great songwriter. I don't know if y'all know his music, but he's a real rising star in country music. Of course, Joni Mitchell is one of the best songwriters ever, I think. An artist I love right now is Brandy Carlisle. I think she and her partners, songwriting partners, the twins, the Hensroth twins, are great songwriters. So many. There's so much good music out there. And I think we have such a wealth of ways to find the music that it makes it hard to find the music sometimes. When I was growing up, you just play the radio and you'd find what you like, and then you'd go buy the album. And now, it's just all out there in the ether floating around, and you have to figure out how to find it. What else? Anybody else? While the mic's going over there, I do want to say that two of my favorite musicians are from Wheeling, Molly and Tim O'Brien. I've worked with Tim a couple times. He's such a wonderful person, as well as great. He can just play anything, so masterfully. Go ahead.
I wonder if you were a reader as a child. You were a writer, but did you have access to books? And what were some of the things you like to read?
Well, I didn't grow up around readers. The only thing in my family, the only thing people read was the Bible. It was just such a religious household that I grew up in. But next door, my aunt, she was sort of the black sheep of the family to some degree. And she had two books in the house. One was Peyton Place, and the other was The Exorcist. So it's like, it's like the sacred and the profane was sort of my childhood. So I'm glad I had that balance. So I would sneak and read those books. And I knew that both of them were really controversial, sort of scandalous books. The Exorcist really scared me. I didn't even want to be in the same room with that book, you know. But she also, my aunt was a yard seller. You know, on the weekends we would go yard selling. She just loved it. And so whatever book I found at the yard sale is what I read. So I read a lot of inappropriate books, you know, because she would just buy me whatever. She never checked them at all. So I read like a lot of Stephen King growing up. Sort of those big pot boiler sort of books like North and South, you know, and a lot of big Civil War novels and things like that. I remember she bought me Mandingo one time. I don't know if y'all remember that novel, but it's pretty scandalous too. And then later, I had a 7th grade English teacher who started directing me to really great books. Not that those books weren't great in their own way, but books that were more appropriate. So the first book that really just set me on fire was To Kill a Mockingbird. And a lot of people had that experience. But also The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton was a big book for me. I love that book. It shows up a lot in my work. And then later, I just slowly found more and more writers. The only TV show that I remember my family watching together was The Waltons. And that was really validating for me to see John Boy Walton, who was a boy from Appalachia who wanted to be a writer. Well, I didn't know any other boys who wanted to be a writer except John Boy Walton. And I was also really lucky to growing up. My aunt always watched Little House on the Prairie, so there was another writer that was really central to my childhood television viewing, you know. And so I think knowing that John Boy and Laura Ingalls Wilder were both people who cared about literature and the written word and stuff, as a child of the 70s and 80s, when we were so inundated by TV, you know, that led me to books too. I read all of the Waltons' little sort of child novelizations they used to have, and then later I read the books that the Waltons were based on, like Spencer's Mountain and The Homecoming and things like that by Earl Hamner. He's from down near Charlottesville, Virginia, in a little place called Schuyler. So I just read anything I could get my hands on, you know. And reading was very encouraged, even though I didn't grow up around readers. Oh, and I had my great aunt. She loved Harriet Arnault, and some of you may know Arnault. She wrote The Dollmaker and Hunter's Horn and books like that. But she was this little holiness woman, you know, who had never cut her hair, and she always wore these little skirts and stuff. And so she would go through all of her Harriet Arnault books with an ink pen and mark out all the words. And it was only like words like hell and damn and stuff like that, but she would mark them all out, you know, in the books, and then I would read them. Anybody else? Yes, back here.
I have a comment or a question. When you were in, I don't even know Juanita, Michael, but this is my teacher. You were talking about working in Nashville when they had a tremendous flood. What river was that?
It was mostly the Cumberland River, but it was also the Harpeth.
Yeah, well, I could see from the pictures how bad it was. We had a flood, it's been since 2004. It was similar where even on my neighborhood, which you can't even see Wheeling Creek. But it got all the way up to the main road, and I know the damage it did, and I can just imagine.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm sure you saw that when you were in Nashville.
Yes.
Mud.
And growing up, you know, I saw a lot of flooding where I grew up. And of course, you know, the poor people, the lower working class people always lived in the floodplains, you know, and so the people who had the least to lose were the ones who lost everything over and over again. And when I was growing up, that was my family, you know, who were trying to crawl their way up into lower middle class. And so, like I said, when I was little, we lost everything in the flood. And so having that personal experience, it's like every time I see a flood, it's just just a different kind of suffering. You know, it's such misery when you've lost everything, you're wet, and et cetera, et cetera. but cold usually. I thought I saw one more hand up somewhere before we close. Was there one more? Yes.
I was going to say, what is your hope for the future to kind of remedy what's going on back and forth between these groups that are so adamant on Facebook and so on? I think the Facebook was terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And we're having a dilemma in our church right now. I'm a Methodist.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yes.
there's a big divide there.
Right.
And it's really a shame.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm Episcopalian now, and we went through the same divide that the Methodist Church is going through right now. And so it led to the Episcopal Church and the Anglican USA Church. They're now two whole separate congregations. Well, I mean, what I always say is that we've got to talk to each other face to face is the main thing. I think it's just so easy to be cruel and awful when you're behind a keyboard, and to have a lot of assumptions, and it's just so easy. I don't know, when you're sitting across from each other, you recognize each other's humanity in a way that you don't when you're looking at a computer screen. So I'm always saying to people, let's talk about this in person. I'm not going to do this on text. I'm not going to do this I have to do that with my family all the time. My first cousins that we're always so close to, we were like siblings. When you're from the mountains, your cousins are your siblings, and now we're at such polar ends of the political divide and cultural divide, and I just refuse to talk to them on Facebook or on text about it. I'm like, if you want to talk, we're going to talk in person, So I think that's one thing, is just to demand that from people and to be willing to listen to people, I think for a long period of my life, I wasn't really willing to listen. I have been taught, you don't let anybody sway your beliefs on anything. And so I took that to mean, you don't listen to anybody's point of view on religion or politics or et cetera. And so once I listened to people, I learned a lot, especially about race. I think I've learned a lot about race by listening to people, because I grew up in a totally segregated community. I grew up in a sundown town, near a sundown town, which is a town where, Black people are literally not welcome. It's a historically sundown town. And so when I went to college and all that, and I would encounter a lot of people who knew I was from that town. They had assumptions about me just because I was from that town, and so it went, we just have to sit down and talk and listen to each other. I mean, it sounds precious, right? But it's really easy. It's easier to do than we might think. I think it's realistic, even though it maybe does sound precious. Well, I sure appreciate y'all's attention. If anybody has a question you would like to ask one-on-one, I'll be here. I'd love to sign your books if you have one. And I can't thank the library enough for putting this on, and thanks to all of you for coming out.